Hey, I'm Sharon, and welcome to Let It Rip. We're coming to you from the CUNY TV studios in the shadow of the Empire State Building in New York City. Now, with over 2 million people in prison, the United States continues year after year to have the highest incarceration rates in the world. In fact, while the United States makes up approximately 4% of the world's population, it accounts for an astonishing 22% of the world's prison population, a deplorable and unacceptable reality. Now, without question, racism and economic factors have played and continue to play a major role in the U.S. mass incarceration crisis. Data shows that Black Americans are much more likely to be incarcerated than any other race. For example, Black people are nearly 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white people and nearly 3 times as likely to be incarcerated as their Latinx counterparts. Black defendants are issued much longer sentences for the exact same crime as their white counterparts. Now, many academic scholars have concluded that mass incarceration is predominantly Black incarceration, which dates back to slavery and the passage of the 13th Amendment. We'll discuss. But first, here to help us discuss the foster care to prison pipeline and the aging incarcerated population is Angela Burton, an attorney and co-author of the New York State Bar Association's 2022 report on racial justice and child welfare, and Anthony Dixon, Deputy Director of the Parole Preparation Project. I'm Sharon, and this is Let It Rip. Angela, I'll start with you. What are some of the challenges that foster kids are experiencing that is leading to them being in contact with the incarceration system?
So I think it's important to sort of back up and talk about the conditions of Black communities in particular, which is the community that I focus on with regard to what we call the family policing system. And basically the system is set up in order to target Black families who are primarily living in poverty, primarily living in conditions where they have to interact with a lot of public authorities in terms of the hospitals, the school system, police, et cetera. And so the conditions that are targeted by the system include things like lack of mental health services, lack of housing, homelessness, lack of sufficient food. A lot of us live in food deserts and things like that. And so these are the types of conditions that teachers, medical professionals, and others are trained to look for, particularly in poverty-stricken and impoverished communities where Black people largely are living.
And so when you make that that connection between policies that are lacking in terms of what kids are going to need in order to be successful going forward, what would you like to see policymakers do? What are some of the urgent things that they need to speak to in order to begin addressing this issue? Sure.
So, one of the things that I'm working on with another group of advocates is something that we're calling the Child and Family Wellbeing Fund. And this would be New York State actually putting aside a certain amount of money to address conditions in communities that are highly targeted and disproportionately affected by the foster care system, right? And so this would identify areas like Brownsville, for example, or upstate New York, like Syracuse, for example, or outside of New York City, like Westchester, for example, where the rates of child removal and government taking of children from Black families is very, very high. It's called the disproportionality index. And so these communities under this particular policy that we're pushing in the legislature would fund actual participatory budgeting and action steps and resources in those communities that they say they need and want.
Anthony, I'd like to come to you. Could you speak to some of the challenges that your folks on your end experience, particularly when it comes to re-entering society?
It's a misnomer to say re-entry when most of these individuals never entered inside society. They've never been socialized. They've been marginalized all their life. And so that's my experience has been like 80% of the individuals have already been underrepresented and that's not their narrative. Reintegration has never occurred in their case.
Okay.
That is a politician, in-house language that we embrace. But the empirical evidence have shown us that we're dealing with people that have dealt with compound alienation and trauma. And so on my end, I deal with individuals that have been in prison for like 25 years or more. I myself was in prison for 32 years, and I've been home now for 8 years. And I went through the system from the age of like 7 upwards, so I know a little bit about this, to be humble about it.
So, I mean, I've worked with folks who are trying to get jobs, and I know one of the things that they face is that initial application, some of which, require them to disclose whether they have a prior conviction. I know states and cities like New York City and New York State, have what they call the Fair Chance Act. Is that something that has been able to make a difference in terms of folks getting back on track?
Well, of course, I think the Fair Chance Act is a step in the right direction, but many people that deal with this area have concluded that once a person served their sentence, sheets need to be wrapped up, records need to be sealed or expunged, because you're dealing with trying to help somebody make it, but you also got statutory laws and legal discrimination called collateral consequences, like 44,000, that impede their integration inside society. So we need more than that.
Okay. And so when you think about the aging population, are there any particular challenges that specifically unique to them when they're integrating back into society that at least policymakers should be aware of?
Right. So the individuals I deal with are the least likely to return. They don't age out of crimes, called the aging out phenomenon. It's one of the oldest crimogenic studies that we have, that these individuals are more equipped because they've been in longer. And it doesn't make sense to keep them in longer when they're going to be a liability in society rather than assets. We equip them with college. We equip them with programs for them to make it. So it stands to reason that we're going to reap the benefits of what taxpayers have already put in to let them out at this time. And we have to address the mass incarceration that has happened for like 50 years in this country by excessive censuses.
Understood. And so, Angela, when we look at the aging prison population, do you see that their initial contact with the criminal justice system sort of now connects them or is unable to get them back on track, and so you see them spending a really long time within the justice system? Is that something that you've experienced?
So here's the thing, right? All of these systems are interconnected and they're built on the same sort of carceral and punitive logics that feed one into the other. And so with the foster system and the foster industry, just as there's a prison industrial complex and industry, there's a foster care industry as well. And so our children are fed into these systems and commodified in ways that leave them unable and thrown away, marginalized, right? And so when you look at statistics around Black children in the foster industry and children generally in the foster industry, they have a much higher risk of being in contact with both the juvenile injustice system as well as with the legal prison system and the criminal system. And so these are just compounding factors that funnel our children, our future, into lack of success and inability to contribute to both our people as well as the society in general.
And so what would you say is the primary reason why when foster kids get in touch with the criminal justice system, that there isn't an increased effort to now divert them back to get on track? Because it seems to me that once there's that initial contact, policymakers essentially don't invest enough resources to try and get folks back. Because I think that would be the best place for you to begin in order for them to prevent them from getting to a place where they are now part of the criminal justice system for the long term.
Well, I mean, we're talking about issues of racism and white supremacy and racial capitalism and all those big isms that are operating every day, both consciously and unconsciously in policymakers as well as in others who interact with black children. And so I think waiting until they've already been captured by the system to start to think about what's best to do at that point, I think is far too late. And so my focus is really on, first of all, dismantling those practices that bring them into the system in the first place. And I'll talk a little bit about what the foster industry and what is called, misnamed child welfare or child protection, right? What that system says it does is to protect children from harm from their parents, to create safety and stability and well-being. Those are the things that it says it does. But the way it's set up to operate is completely on a carceral basis. It's an investigation. Once somebody calls and says, oh, this child, may need, is coming to school with dirty clothes or coming to school hungry and is asking for food every day, there's a call that a teacher or someone at the school makes to a hotline. That hotline call leads to an investigation, not an assessment of whether or not there are needs that could be met at that point. It's an investigation to find wrongdoing on the part of the parent. And parents can be prosecuted. That would be the next step in family court. And it is a prosecution, right, for not having enough food, for being homeless, right, et cetera. And then that prosecution, which those court cases can last for a very long time, while children are separated from their families, right? And then they can be found guilty of something called neglect, which is defined basically with regard to conditions of poverty.
Great points. Anthony, I want to come back to you. When we think about the aging population in prison, what would be the best way to address the aging factor, particularly with regard to a point that you said earlier in terms of saying, hey, they have lower rates of recidivism, if not any?
No, that's a profound question. When I think about New York, we're dealing with like 4 states that's been in competition with who can get the most money and who can lock up people the most. Those 4 for the last 50 years has been California, Texas, Florida, and New York. In New York, one out of every 3 to 4 individuals have a life sentence and or are over the age of 50 right now. That's profound to think about.
That's pretty high.
So what we have done is we formulated 2 bills. One is called the Elder Parole Act. And the other bill is the Fair and Timely bill that says that a person should be evaluated based on who they are today, not who they was when they was first arrested. People do change.
Thank you so much. That was a great discussion, but we'll have to end it there. So I just want to thank our guests, Angela Burton and Anthony Dixon, for joining us. Let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion around mass incarceration and get a first-hand look at this ongoing crisis. I'm Sharon, and this is Let It Rip. Hey, I'm Sharon, and welcome back to Let It Rip. Now, a recent report from the United Nations Human Rights Council concluded that the United States prisons are racist and engage in conduct that is an affront to human dignity. The report revealed that a significant number of black women were often shackled to their beds during childbirth, which led to some of them losing their baby. And in other instances, male prisoners were forced to work in, and I quote, plantation-style conditions that mimic slavery. Additionally, the report also highlighted the widespread use of solitary confinement, which appeared to be disproportionately applied to black inmates. Now, here to help us discuss the brutal and inhumane nature of the United States penal system is Sharon Richardson, founder of Reentry Rocks, and Eugene Pursoo, a former ambassador to the UN for Grenada and professor at Medgar Evers College. Welcome to you both. Eugene, I want to start with you.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on the report?
I was struck by the report. And why? It's because the United Nations rarely are that blunt. They are usually reluctant to interfere into the internal matters of member states. And so when I saw the report, I was pleasantly surprised.
Given some of the work that you've done, has there been a report of this kind that any country responded to positively and said, we're going to go ahead and act on some of the recommendations that were made?
Well, this is the first time I've seen a report that calls out a nation like that. Most of the reports are reports that investigate conditions of disadvantages or so conditions of poverty, and then make recommendations. But to actually call out a nation, as this report did, this is the first I've seen. And so it's, at this point in time, it's questionable how the United States would respond, even if they give any consideration to the report at all.
Okay. And Sharon, I want to come to you. You know, what's your take on some of the conditions inside prisons and what women face? You know, because I think there's this notion that somehow just because we've imprisoned somebody, that means that we don't continue to invest in them, at least invest in their rehabilitation so that when they come back out, they're ready to hit the ground running.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts on that is how can rehabilitation begin? How can programming begin to address any issues that you may have when there are so many other issues with just being incarcerated? And so for many of us who are incarcerated and have gone through the abuse, right? We're talking about racial, abuse. We're talking about sexual abuse. We're talking about mental abuse, physical abuse in some instances, that have actually taken place.
And was that something that you experienced either personally or you had a first-hand account of seeing it happen?
Yeah, so I've never experienced any of those things myself. I thank God for that, but I did have firsthand seeing it happen to my friends and people who were incarcerated.
But are there any built-in mechanisms, such as allowing a person to file a complaint based on sexual harassment or any other type of abuse, particularly when it comes to women, given their vulnerability in that state?
Yeah, so while you're incarcerated, you can report an officer.
Okay,
You
right.
can, go to a grievance process and speak directly to a higher up while you're incarcerated. Now, does it go anywhere?
Okay.
Of course not, right? Wherever it lands is where it lands, and most of the time it lands in the trash.
Okay. And so when you're now helping or assisting folks coming out of prison, what are some of the challenges that you're forced to, to deal with in order to help them get back?
So once I'm working with formerly incarcerated women who have gone through the criminal justice system, one of the main things that you want to do with them is build trust. And that's what we do at Reentry Rocks. We build trust so that women are able to speak about everything, not just the transitioning piece of coming home, but what it was like to actually be in prison, come out, now have to deal with parole, probation, right? Maybe an open case, right? Losing their family. So there's a lot that has to be dealt with in dealing with my program. And so, yeah, building trust is one of the top priorities.
Okay. Huh. That's a great point. Eugene, I want to come back to you with regard to this idea of reform, right? Do we really want to reform the United States penal system, or do we want to abolish it? Because like you said, there's not a lot of faith there.
Right. But first, let me, even before
Sure.
I answer your question, let me commend Sharon for creating this organization to address the issue of reentry. And the reason why it's important, the people that create our problem cannot be expected to be the same people to solve our problems. That's a given. So it's up to us to create the problems. And those problems, by the way, that the UN report on are not new. They're as old as this country itself. Because this country was born with slaves. And some of the conditions, as you articulated from the report, persist up to this date. Forced labor on a plantation that was once a slave plantation, and we have the same practice going on today, it speaks to the continuity of that problem. And I think it was Albert Einstein that said, the mindset that creates a problem cannot be the same mindset to solve it.
But I'm still curious to hear what your take is as to whether the solution is to either completely abolish the carceral system.
Yeah,
and how a politician would do that, given that the present crop of Republican...
Well, I don't expect the politicians to do it. I expect the people. Now, politicians usually do things in incremental changes, if ever. And there's a reason why. A politician's primary objective in life is to be reelected, to retain office. Without an office, a politician is nothing, and they know that. So their primary purpose in life is to get reelected. It is up to us, the people, to actually decide how we're going to go about it. From my perspective, this problem calls for a total revamping of the system. And it's not going to be easy. It cannot be easy because there are forces who benefit from it being the way it is.
Okay. And so when, I know the United Nations report talks about reform, but do you think the system can be reformed? Because one of the things that you said is this idea that, it almost feels as though people in prison are forgotten completely. Mm-hmm. And whatever grievances they may have, they're not taken seriously. Mm-hmm. What's your take on that?
So I think that we as formerly incarcerated individuals and any of the sisters that we have left behind, including men, there is a point of reform, right? But the reform has to continue once the person comes out. Why? Because it's important to be able to continue that process. You can't do it alone. You need the support system of others, those that have come home who have gone through and walked that same platform to be able to understand what it is that you have gone through in the system. It's not easy and you cannot do it alone. And while you're incarcerated, you are forced to do it alone, right? You have to be careful who you talk to, right? You have to be careful to not share certain things with your family because you don't want that to fall on your family in the visiting room, right? You have to be careful even talking and feeling comfortable to maybe someone who you feel like you can trust, like an officer or a civilian that's working there, because you can get into a lot of trouble. They do not want certain things to be let out.
Huh. Given your work in this space, what are some of the things that you'd love to see policymakers do to be able to actually support some of the stuff that you're doing?
I would hope that at some point, and I'm believing that this is going to happen, that a training tool is put into place utilizing formerly incarcerated individuals, both men and women, to be able to speak to problems and solutions and hear the words coming from the mouths of those who experienced it best.
Okay. Great discussion, but we'll have to end it there. I want to thank our guests, Sharon Richardson and Eugene Pursoo. And when we come back, I'll give my final thoughts on the 13th Amendment and mass incarceration. I'm Kero Gashuro, and this is Let It Rip. We end with our final thoughts on mass incarceration in America. It is not surprising that mass incarceration is rooted in slavery, where many believe that enslaved Africans were freed, but what really happened was a transition from the plantation to the penitentiary. The 13th Amendment, which is falsely believed to have enshrined the end of slavery in the U.S. Constitution, actually had an exception that slavery is legal as punishment for a crime. This exception to the 13th Amendment made it possible for former enslavers to continue using black labor to enrich themselves. To ensure a steady stream of black bodies to fill up penitentiaries that would provide much-needed labor, many states passed laws with increased prison sentences, such as vagrancy and the pig laws, which guaranteed a steady stream of prison labor. Research reveals that shortly after slavery, the prison population of Africans grew from 45% to 65%. Today, that model still continues, where the prison industrial complex relies on a steady supply of prisoners that transform the entire economy of communities, as well as providing a windfall for private prisons. Yet this prison boom has failed to address the root causes of why many people end up in prisons. Some reasons include poverty, a lack of mental health access, a lack of affordable housing, and institutional racism. Now, without policies specifically designed to address these quality of life issues, the United States will continue to lead the world in incarcerating its citizens, despite the fact that it has the resources to invest in housing, education, living wage jobs, and increase access to mental health services, all of which promise to radically improve the quality of life for most of its citizens. I'm Kero Gashuro, and this is Let It Rip.